Welcome, Iroise. It's really good of you to come and do this interview for us. It's one of the things that Learnus has been trying to do for a long time, is to get people like yourself to explain what you're doing and why you think it might be relevant to people who are working in education in particular. So perhaps you would just introduce yourself to the audience.
Yeah, so my name is Iroise Dumontheil and I'm a reader in cognitive neuroscience at Birkbeck in the Department of Psychological Sciences, but I'm also affiliated with the Center for Educational Neuroscience, which is kind of a multi-university center trying to look into educational neuroscience research. And in terms of my background, I come from biological sciences. That's why I studied as an undergraduate student, but I then decided to kind of study the brain, and I was interested in cognitive neuroscience.
So in talking about this field to other people, whether they're professionals or just sort of interested members of the population, what would you say are some of the key messages that come from both your research and research more generally in this area that might be useful to them?
Very broad question. So in terms of my research, I've been studying adolescent brain and cognitive development, and what we're finding is that there seem to be, well, first, cognition continues to kind of progress for quite a long time into adolescence. So adolescents are still kind of not as good as adults in terms of things like working memory or being able to stop yourself, like a dominant response, or they're also less good in aspects of social cognition in terms of taking into account someone else's perspective. So we're finding this, and that's also associated with quite prolonged development of the brain. So there are changes in the structure and the anatomy of the brain that continues all through adolescence and into the early 20s. And this is kind of really recent cognitive neuroscience research that has shown this. In terms of what it means to other people, I think sometimes people used to say, oh, adolescence is just hormones. But actually we're finding that it's more complex than that. There are some influence of hormones and pubertal changes, but there are also other influences in terms of the influence of peers and how the brain seems to be, in adolescent brain, is very sensitive to emotions and reacts more strongly to emotions and social reward. And so we're trying to understand what this means and how that might impact education. Examples of how it might impact it would be that, for example, the social context and social links are so important during adolescence. There's maybe some evidence that if you want to try and change behavior in a school or in a classroom, if you try to target the influencers, so the peers that are well regarded by kind of the other group, and if you get them to change, then you're that might trickle through down, and kind of other people, other teenagers will adopt the same kind of behavior. And that's kind of really interesting in terms of how this kind of particular interest to kind of others in this kind of social context and might be one way into kind of changing adolescent behavior.
One of the areas of adolescent behaviour that has always sort of fascinated me is the issue of risk, and when adolescents are more risk averse or more inclined to take risks. Does the research tell us anything about that? Yeah, so there's
most of the research is a lot of the research has looked at that in terms of the social context again. So what we're finding is, in fact, in certain conditions, adolescents don't actually take more risk than adults. They can kind of evaluate the risk in the same way. But if you change the context a bit in terms of whether the reward might be social, whether it involves other people, whether they're watched when they're doing the risky behavior, then you see differences in performance between adolescents and adults. And so it's really this kind of social influence that seems to kind of matter in interaction with reward. So, but the kind of other bit is to say that, we mentioned that adolescents, there's more risk-taking and there's actually more death from things associated with risk-taking, but in fact it's kind of still a very small proportion of adolescents who really behave in a really risky and take kind of major risks. But you have the whole spectrum of risks. And adolescence is probably going to be the phase where you do a little bit more risk, but it's also a phase where you can take more, you have more choice. So you're less kind of under the umbrella of your parents, so you kind of have more freedom. And then that means you can, then maybe take more risk. And in fact, the research suggests that into the 20s, early 20s, that's, for some behavior, that's when you see peak risk taking. It's not necessarily adolescence per se, it's a bit later, because again, that's when you have more freedom to, to not be with your parents, to maybe drink, to kind of take drugs and things like that, that you might not do when you're 14, you might not have the opportunity to do when you're 14. So yeah, the research is kind of, in particular the neuroscience is kind of, there's this model that parts of the brain that responds to reward and kind of strong emotions are maturing or kind of drive behavior more during adolescence, because there's less top-down, what we call top-down control from the executive function system, which is trying to make sure that you achieve your goals and that you don't get distracted and you think about the consequences of your actions and things like that. And so this kind of systems are not maturing at the same time, and during adolescence there is more of the kind of influence of the reward and the social context, and less so in a kind of more mature adult. Am I right in thinking that the research is telling us we need to take much more attention to social activities and interactions between the students? Because in my head, learning is a social activity, and yet so often we present it as something which was one-directional, i.e. the teacher telling. And so am I right in thinking that we've got to take pay more attention to this social aspect and how it works? Yeah, I mean, the social aspect I've been looking at is more, or in adolescence, is the interactions between the peers. But I think between the teacher and the pupil, I think there's a lot there. But I don't think there's been that much research, or at least cognitive neuroscience research. I think there's been more research in the past in terms of, if you have a very positive image of your teacher, then they'll have influence your behavior and your academic success, a lot. But I don't think there's much been done recently in terms of cognitive neuroscience. But I guess that's in educational neuroscience research. We've been looking a lot at the pupils, but not yet much at the teachers or at the interaction between the teachers and the pupils. I think that's still more research to happen about this, but I think it's important. That's an area for development. Yeah. We've spoken quite a lot about adolescence, which is obviously the main focus, but I know you've also worked with younger children, primary age children as well. What are the differences, if there are any, between working with adolescents and working with the younger children? What are the maybe challenges of working with younger children? So it depends a bit what you're doing. So first, in general, we have to adapt the tasks we're doing so that they are the right level of difficulties for the different age group. With children, I think we make a bit more effort to make the tasks a bit more kind of game-like, a bit more entertaining in terms of the stimuli, that they're kind of a bit nicer to look at. While we worry about less with adolescents. The adolescent worry is more whether to get them engaged and kind of sufficiently motivated. The children are a bit more keen to do well and kind of participate with the researcher, while adolescents, I've had cases where it doesn't seem they're making much effort in terms of responding. In terms of cognitive neuroscience research, I do functional magnetic resonance imaging, which is those brain scanners where we can take image of the brain and look at patterns of brain activity when people are doing different things. The problem here with children is that they find it much harder to stay still for a long time, which not be super long, but can be periods of 5 or 10 minutes. And that's really a difficulty. So we have to try and train them to stay still and kind of practice that, but we still have a lot of children who have difficulties. So that's one of the challenges in terms of looking at different age groups. They have different kind of strength and weaknesses in terms of how we're testing them. But is there any work which follows children through from primary through adolescence to adulthood to actually look at some of the factors that we're interested in terms of learning, that actually give us that longitudinal type study, all right? Yeah, there are some. So basically longitudinal studies that when we kind of test the same people multiple times, they're the kind of holy grail. The problem is that they take a long time. So there's like a massive research, and then you're trying to kind of get funding for every new wave of data collection. But there are existing ones. So there's one in New Zealand with, for example, looked at those marshmallow type studies and trying to see whether if you're able to resist kind of immediate reward, that actually seems to predict a lot of things in like adult life. And in the UK, there's also a number of cohort. One of them I've worked with is called the ALSPAC cohort, which is in Bristol. And there we have done research For example, trying to see whether aspects of executive functions, for example, so looking at how much working memory, so what you can keep in mind for a short time, whether that can predict your improvement in academic outcomes like over the course of adolescence. There's a lot of evidence in primary school, but trying to see does it still matter during adolescence, like in secondary school? And we found that it does, and it's important for English and science and maths, kind of all subjects. So yes, there's kind of research trying to track this, but we find that some things matter across all ages and other things seem to be particularly important at specific time in your development. And then now the research is looking a little bit more in terms of individual differences, which is, kind of you need large sample to do that, and trying to see whether you can split different type of, like different groups of children who have better outcome or kind of delayed improvements, and what predicts this. And that's kind of where the research is going at the moment in terms of with these bigger longitudinal samples.
One of the things that I know you've been involved in, because you've worked with Learnus on this as part of the UnLocke project, looking at primary school children's understanding of counterintuitive concepts.
Yep.
Can you just sort of give us some idea of what that project has done and whether you think it's been successful or not?
So what the project did, based on some previous research, was to try and encourage children to, well, first tell children about the fact that in maths and science, quite often, the first answer, the first kind of response that comes to their mind to a problem might not be correct. And that there is cases where what you're seeing is actually misleading, what you've kind of experienced in your life is misleading, and then you end up kind of giving your first answer and it's incorrect. And so that's the first thing, is giving this awareness. The second thing we were trying to do is to encourage then children to stop and think about things rather than just go with their first answer. And to encourage that kind of a bit reflection and having time to reason, to find kind of a reasoned answer, and to maybe retrieve what they've learned at school in that particular situation. So this was kind of done as a computerized activity, learning activity led by the teacher on the whiteboard to the whole classroom. It was kind of run over 10 weeks in both math and science, and what we found was that it did seem to lead to improvement, I believe around 2 months improvement in science for year 5 children, around 1 month improvement in maths. That was kind of, didn't reach significance, but it was kind of along the same line, where the children who did this stop and think training seemed to be performing better on standardized tests of science and maths, so when they were aged 9, 10 years old. So this kind of fits with some of the previous research, and we think it's kind of quite interesting because science and maths is topics that can be quite difficult for children or viewed as being difficult for children. Science is particularly under-researched compared to maths, and so any strategies that might kind of help children kind of acquire what we call these kind of counterintuitive concepts or kind of cope with them better, I think is kind of quite well valued. But something that also emerged from this research, which we also kind of carried out similar kind of studies, not training studies, but kind of more association studies in adolescents, is that it seems in maths, sometimes teachers might have this trying to get rapid, kind of speeded responses. And actually that might not be the best approach to do. It might be good to, at least in some cases, to encourage children to spend a bit more time so they don't give the first kind of wrong answer, encourage them to stop and think about things.
Do you think there are any lessons coming out at this stage from that work that we ought to be able to pass on to teachers?
Yes, I mean, from the feedback from teachers, they seemed that they found it quite promising as a kind of intervention. There are some technological problems, but so I think we definitely will follow up trying to kind of improve this and see whether we can roll it out more. But the lesson was that, it seemed to help the children. They were kind of talking about it, might be even transferred to other domains of kind of subjects at school. And also gave the teachers some awareness of the number of counterintuitive concepts that the children had to cope with and face in their kind of primary school education. And that it seemed to, this kind of reasonably simple change because you might need, a few times telling children, oh, watch out, this is kind of, your first thought might not be the correct one, remember to stop and think. It's not a high demand thing. We're not saying necessarily that you have to do the computerized program. Already talking about this and kind of trying to integrate this stop and thinking approach in the teaching might be kind of a small change, but that might have an impact if repeated, across the school year.
That's good to hear. It works with my experience from my own teaching perspective. Just thinking more generally into that whole debate about what can teachers, educators learn from neuroscience or the educational, where do you see that going, and where do you think there is potential?
Well, so first I just want to flag out that, it's a slow, I think it's happening. It's a slow progress. There's only a limited number of researchers and a limited, number of things we can look at, but I think we're gradually getting kind of banking some things that we think are promising for education, and there seems kind of there be evidence for it. Where things are going, on the genetic kind of type neuroscience, there's this whole idea about more individualized learning and what we can kind of early on detect through different types of neuroimaging techniques, different type of testing techniques, children at risk for a poor outcome. So rather than waiting for them, I was discussing that with a colleague yesterday, rather than waiting for them to have failed their language test 2 years in a row for them to have support for their dyslexia, if we could try to catch them much earlier, saying, oh, this child has a selective attention deficit for kind of orphonological processing deficit, we think that they're at risk of dyslexia, we'll give a bit extra support. That's kind of, this individualized kind of identification might be kind of something of interest for the future. I think the next step is also to compare different interventions. So for example, there's a lot about sport. There's research about mindfulness meditation, for example. But what's better? The time is limited in school. Are they better off having more time running around in a school, or are they better off spending 20 minutes meditating and things like that? We don't know yet. We don't know what's the kind of, better, like different type of maybe intervention we're kind of generating, which one might be better. And it's probably likely that it's the combination, that everything has a small effect. And if we kind of actually put together bigger programs that be of interest. And then maybe the last tack is, last two, there's one about character education, which is something that Ofsted has put forward as like a new kind of thing that they're looking into. So in terms of, in particular, adolescents, but also children and adolescents, how you can help foster like things like self-regulation and kind of achieving your goals and things that are not kind of straight academic success. And for adolescents in particular, mental health is kind of also a big issue in terms of how you can try early on, kind of maybe give adolescents the tools to maybe cope with the kind of difficulties of adolescence and early adulthood, and being better able to cope and then maybe have less mental health problems.
In an ideal world, how do you think we can sort of bridge that gap? I know that's slightly contentious phrase, but between the research and the practice and the policy as well, really. Yeah,
so between the research and the practice, I think there's different tracks. One is teacher education, but it's a very constrained in the UK in terms of how much time teachers have to kind of during the training. So it's very hard. We advocate, have more educational neuroscience in there, but it's so limited that I think currently it's not really possible. So in an ideal world, they would have more time for training, and so we could kind of tell them more about educational neuroscience and the brain and how the brain might respond to education and learning. Second, ideal world would be to have more integration in terms of having maybe dedicated teachers who are liaison with, who link with researchers in each school. And so that can help kind of foster more research collaboration and both directions, saying, oh, my school is really interested as this problem. Have you researched this and that? Because sometimes, I need to think about the next topic I want to research. I wouldn't mind being told, oh, that's a problem teachers are having. Can you study, what can we do about it? What's going on here? So I think that's kind of really two kind of key things. In terms of policy, Again, I think the problem with policy is this kind of short-term, like, we want kind of effect, we know that they're reliable, we want to apply them now, and research is kind of a bit as a slower pace, and we want to be a bit more confident that, we want to say, yeah, this works, and to get really strong evidence, it takes a bit of time. So I think this is kind of difficult, but that's where Learnus is kind of quite useful in terms of trying to link these different groups, and because we're not trained to talk to policy makers necessarily, or we don't have their contact. So having groups that maybe help with that link is kind of useful.